What's up, guys? Today we're going to be starting a project that I've wanted to do for a really long time now, and we're going to answer the age-old question, can you swap an N55 into an N20 powered car? Now, if you take a look online, anytime somebody asks that question, you're going to get one of two answers. People are either going to say, well, if you're asking questions like that, then you don't really know what you're talking about and you shouldn't be doing it. Or they'll say that you should sell the 328 and buy an equivalent spec 335. Now, I really can't stand those answers because it's such a cop-out. These guys have no idea how to do it either, but they are right in about 90% of cases. If you live in North America or Europe and you have a 328 and you're thinking about doing a swap, it's almost always going to be cheaper for you to sell the car and buy the 335. However, there are some cases where a swap might make sense. For example, in some of the international markets, the price difference between a 328 and a 335 is massive. Around here, it's a couple $1,000, but in some places, it's upwards of like 15 grand. The other time it would make sense would be if the car was never sold in your market, like this beautiful 2015 F31 328i Wagon. I mean, just look at this thing. I love wagons, but in North America, we only got the 4 poppers. This is the nicest spec they sold them in. You've got the M Sport package, adaptive suspension, heads-up display, Harman Kardon audio, and naturally, since it's an N20, the engine comes pre-blown, no extra charge. So instead of rebuilding another one of these crappy engines, we're going to swap in an N55, boost it, and make arguably one of the coolest cars on the road. Let me start by saying that I am definitely not the first person to do this. I've seen a couple of really nice swap projects, N54 into an E91 wagon, and this 55 M3 conversion on an F31 wagon, but I haven't seen anyone do an N55 on any F-Series cars for whatever reason. The thing is, even the ones who have done similar cool projects don't really explain in any kind of detail how it's done. Sure, there's a couple of dead-end forum or Reddit posts that talk vaguely about it, but there's never a follow-up. So my goal with this project is to cover it with the same level of detail that you guys are used to seeing from this channel. This is our first building block, a low mileage N55. It only has 45,000 miles or about 70,000 kilometers, and these engines are definitely not cheap. Unlike the N63s, there's no class action lawsuit against the N55s where you can pick up a brand new engine from BMW for super cheap. So on the used market, the N55 is quite an expensive engine. I wanted the nicest, lowest mileage example I could find because we won't be doing a complete rebuild on this one. This engine's already been compression and leak down tested, and it's working like new. Basically, what we're going to be doing is stripping off all the accessories and giving it a complete refresh. Rod bearings, oil pan gasket, valve cover gasket, water pump. Take care of all the common failure points before we try and put it into the car. One of the reasons I got this engine for a good price was because first off, the wiring harness is damaged here. It looks like someone tried to splice this at one point, but I'm going to replace it altogether. And the second thing is somehow, and I actually have no idea how this damage could happen, the AC bracket is cracked. No big deal, these are dirt cheap used, and we'll be putting on new pulleys later anyway, but even brand new, I think it's only about $100. So first up, we're going to strip the entire engine down, get this wiring harness off, and then we'll have a better idea of what needs to be done. So I'm just going to start with the valve cover here and start getting some of this stuff out of the way. Okay, that looks good. Nice. Now we'll get these spark plugs out of here. Okay, I'll give you a close-up of that in a little bit, but this looks really good. Ooh, this one doesn't feel good. Huh, what? Oh, I really don't like the way that feels. I mean, It looks exactly the same as the other ones. I don't know why that was so much harder to remove. Here's a close-up of the spark plugs. On the right side, you have the front cylinder, and on the left side, you have the back cylinder, which was the one I had trouble getting out. I don't know, maybe there was some caught in threads because, as you can see, it looks exactly the same as the rest of them. And these spark plugs are a really good indication for this engine. You can tell from the color that the engine was running extremely well, very even combustion, not burning oil or anything like that. So this is a good sign. Now we'll get the fuel rail out of the way. Okay, and now we've just got this one connector, the main line over here. Try and catch at least some of this fuel. And now this should just lift right off. Yes, maybe. There we go. Perfect. So now we should be able to get this valve cover off. It's important to remember that when you're taking these off, follow the instructions in the service manual of the correct sequence in which to loosen these bolts, because since it's plastic, over time it can warp, get brittle, and crack. And now that these are all cracked loose, we can zip them all the way off. Also have to get the eccentric shaft motor seal out of the way. Okay, and now we should be able to lift the valve cover off. Okay, like this, and what do we have inside? Wow, that is very clean. Peel off this gasket. I think this was probably done fairly recently because this gasket is extremely soft. Honestly, it doesn't even need to be changed, but we'll be doing it while we're in here anyway. Okay, well, there you go. As you can see, super clean in here. I mean, it's kind of what I was expecting with a low mileage engine like this, but to be fair, even with 45,000 miles, if the guy wasn't doing proper oil change intervals, it'd be a lot darker, there'd be a lot more varnish buildup, and this is a really nice light golden color. So this is well taken care of. All the cam lobes look absolutely perfect, no wear whatsoever. And the timing chain, as you can see, tight. N55s don't really have any issues with timing chains, so since it's such low mileage and in such good shape, I'm not going to be touching the timing system at all. So I mean, there's not really much to do in here besides replace the gasket and put it back together. I'm going to be using the OE for this, which is Cortico. Give the sealing surface a quick wipe down. So again, on the install, first I'm going to run these down with the E-ratchet in the correct torque sequence. Then we'll come back and re-torque them all to 8.5 Newton meters. Nice. Now we can do the Valvetronic motor gasket. And for whatever reason, I can't find the torque spec on this in the service manual. So these are just really small screws going into plastic. So I'm going to put them just hand tight. Now we're going to install some new spark plugs. So the ones I'm using are these NGK 97506s. And the reason I'm using these is because it's a one-step colder plug, and with the new turbo we're going to install along with the tune, the cylinder head temperatures are going to be a little bit hotter than stock, so the one-step colder plug just helps keep everything a little bit more in balance. Now, it's important to note that these come pre-gapped at 0.762 millimeters, but for any N54, N55, or S55 applications, you need to re-gap them to 0.56 millimeters. I already gapped these off camera, so now I'm gonna run these in. I always do this by hand. And then torque to 23 Newton meters. Now we'll do new ignition coils. So these are Eldor brand. I found it weird that it comes in this box that says BBT on it, but after doing some research, FCP Euro told me that Eldor doesn't have a retail division, so they don't actually sell the coils in their own box. They sell them through this company called BBT. These Eldor coils are the latest and greatest from BMW. That's what they use in all their newer engines, but they are also backwards compatible with these. Any car that has the Bosch or Delphi style, you can replace them with Eldor, and the price difference really isn't that much, so it's kind of a no-brainer if you're changing them to get these. Okay, and now we're not going to reinstall the wiring harness yet. Obviously, like I said, it needs to be replaced. So for now, we're done up top. Let's keep going on the other side. Now I'll get the turbo off. That would have really not been fun if I dropped that while this was in the car. Now I'll do this coolant pipe. Get this thing out of the way. Okay, so let's get this out of the way. Okay, we'll do the last of these turbo lines here. There we go. Jesus Christ. Now there's just two more T45s on the bottom of the turbo here that hold it to the engine. You could remove these while keeping this arm in place, but I'm gonna have a little bit better access if I get this out of the way, so I'm just gonna remove it first. Now we can get these two. And now we should be able to get this thing off. Yes. See as heavy as it looks. So if you take a look inside, I'm not sure how well you guys can see it from this angle, but you can see that all the valves are just slightly white, which is exactly what you want to see on an engine that's running properly. Honestly, all the cars that I work on are usually burning so much oil that they're completely gummed up, full of carbon buildup and all kinds of crap. These look absolutely perfect. Now we can continue taking this wiring harness off. What a mess. Okay, and now most of the rest of these wires are connected on the junction box underneath the intake manifold, so we're going to take that off. Okay, now I'm going to unhook this, but I know it's not going to come all the way off because there's still things connected behind here. Okay, I'm gonna try and gently disconnect these lines and not break anything. And then I think it's just this one for the throttle body. This and this, well, it looks like we're good. So on the back of the intake manifold, there's this port here, and this is actually where the DME bolts up to. So it's cool because the DME is actually air cooled. So obviously the guy already removed it, and that's why this wiring is kind of a big mess. Honestly, I wish that he hadn't, because now I'm not really sure how things are supposed to go, but once we get the new wiring harness, we'll try and route everything correctly. So again, at this point, I don't really know what's what, so I'm just disconnecting everything, and once we get the new harness, we'll put everything back on properly. See, I'm even finding these little phantom screws from when he was disconnecting brackets and never put them back on. Oh, I'm really gonna get tripped up over this fuel pump right now. Are you kidding me? Is there, oh no, I can disconnect it from this junction box. Yes, haha, okay, nice. So that can stay, and everything else comes out. There we go. Oh mon Dieu. Oh mon Dieu. Fuck, what a disaster. I hate dealing with wiring harnesses. And again, another thing I'm super surprised with is the condition of the valves. I was expecting to at least have to walnut blast this engine, but there's almost no carbon buildup at all. Okay, so that all looks really good. I'm gonna swap out this bracket. I'm also gonna remove these transmission cooler lines because either way, we're gonna need to take the oil pan off and they're bolted to the oil pan. Oh boy. That is surely cross-threaded. So like I said, I have no idea how this kind of damage would even happen. Doesn't matter, like I said, super cheap. I got to use one for 20 bucks and then we'll just replace the pulley. I'm not going to put anything back on just yet. I want to strip off as much as we can so that way we can clean the outside of the engine as much as possible before we put all the new parts on. Something I probably should have started with would be to remove this oil filter just so we can see what we got inside. Huh. I was under the impression that this was drained. Wow, well, I guess this guy got in the accident right after his oil change because this oil is brand new. Now we can take care of these last couple things on the front of the engine. So we'll start with the famous Mickey Mouse coolant flange. Yeah, and you can see even with low kilometers, this flange always goes bad. You can see this plastic is starting to get real brittle, so we'll replace this with the aluminum replacement. Now we'll get the oil cooler. And lastly, the famous oil filter housing. I'm pretty sure that they did the oil filter housing gasket at the same time as they did the valve cover because as you can see, this is extremely soft, very supple, so this is definitely not original. Either way though, gonna replace it anyway. And I'm actually also gonna remove the Vano solenoids so that way we can clean these as well. Wow, definitely the cleanest solenoids I've ever pulled out. Definitely didn't need to do this, but that's okay. We're here, we'll do it anyway. Now we're gonna get the oil pan off so we can get started on these rod bearings. Wow, okay, very interesting. This is damage too. Again, I don't know how this would have even happened. The good news for us is that this axle carrier bearing, whatever you want to call this piece, is the exact same on the 335 as on the 328. So we'll be able to transfer this from the other engine. Now we'll work our way around and get all the bolts for the oil pan off. These are also one-time use bolts, so they do need to be replaced. And I'm not sure how well it shows up on camera. I don't know if you can see all the bolts, but I'll make sure to put it up on screen so you guys know exactly what to do. Always double check there's no more bolts left over before you start prying. Looks good to me. And now when we take this off, we should have a beautiful mess all over the floor. Now obviously doing this out of the car on a stand is a lot easier to see, but this is one of the jobs that you can do in the car. The most difficult part is getting the oil pan off, but once it's off, everything that you need to do is the same from here on out. Now, since we're going to be working inside the engine now, it's important that you're working with clean tools and clean surfaces all the time. You saw the amount of gunk and crap that was on the outside of the engine when we took the oil pan off, And then what happens is that all gets stuck into your socket. So that if I start working, all that sand and grit, even if I try and wipe it off, is going to somehow end up falling into the engine. So before you even start working, make sure that all your tools are perfectly clean. Now we've got clean tools, clean gloves, we're good to go. So first up, you've got to get this oil pickup tube / windage tray out of the way. It's an interesting design on these cars. It's just one piece of plastic that does both jobs. And these bolts, again, are one-time use, so you'll need to buy a set of those as well. Those are all the same size, and now we can gently pull this out of the oil pump. And obviously, we'll replace this gasket when we're putting it back. Now to actually change the rod bearings, as you can see, everything is wide open, so it's really easy to work, except for the first cylinder. This is the front of the engine here, because it's underneath the oil pump. Now, according to the official BMW documentation, when you take the oil pump off, you need to use a couple special tools. First, to lock the sprocket, undo the bolt, and then make sure the timing stays in place. Now, I'm not going to do that because it's actually possible to take the oil pump off, do the rod bearing, and as long as the engine doesn't spin or nothing rotates, if you put the oil pump back on, put the sprocket back on, you're good to go. Now again, there is a special tool you're supposed to use that butts up against the block to counter hold the sprocket, but since we're not using that, all I'm going to do is use my 22mm on the crank bolt, and then I'm going to break this loose. It's important to note that this is a regular bolt, it's not reverse thread. Okay, now we can take this out. 2 E10s on the front of the oil pump that hold the chain in place. Now we've got 1, 2, 3 on the oil pump itself. And with that out of the way, now we can gently pry up on the oil pump and get it out. All right, there you go. And now we've got perfect access to do this rod bearing. Now for this first one, I'm just going to speed run it. I'm not going to explain too much because with the oil pump off, I really want to be paying attention to make sure not to move anything while I'm working. Once this first one is done and we get the oil pump back on, then I'll get you a closer view and explain a little bit more on some of the other ones. Now we can get this guy back on. Just pay attention because these front 2 bolt holes have dowels. And then you can just gently push the sprocket back on. Now we'll put the new bolts in for the oil pump. Again, these are one-time use, so you have to buy the whole kit. And what's good is that the kit comes with the bolts for the oil pump and the bolts for the windage tray as well. Now the longest one goes in this corner. The medium length one goes here. And the shortest one goes on the top. Now the longest one is torqued to 10 Newton meters plus 180. The 2 shorter ones are 10 Newton meters plus 90. And then the sprocket, 20 Newton meters plus 45 degrees. Last 2 bolts are the E10s that hold the chain module to the oil pump. Okay, now again, I'm going to start by breaking these loose. Let's check this one out. What are we dealing with? So basically same as the others here. Not much wear on the bottom. Push the rod down. Use your bolt to pull it back up. And again, same thing here. A little bit more wear on the upper loaded side, but nothing major. Clean the cap. Clean the rod. And clean the crank. To get the new bearing in, you just line up the tang and press down. Same thing for the upper. Push the rod back down and then onto the crank. Again, being super careful and slow so you don't damage the crank. When you do the plastic gauge clearance, the crank is supposed to be completely dry, but I always add a little bit of silicone spray just because it makes it easier to wipe the plastic gauge off when we're done. Gently place the plastic gauge down. Rod cap. Run the old bolts down. Now we're going to do the torque angle, and I've bought myself this fancy tool. This is the BMW original tool that they say to use in a service manual. So put my socket on the back, get this lined up, and then we have to find something magnetic that we can attach this to. Now you want to get this lined up with the 0 degree mark. Get your ratchet on, and now we can do our 70 degrees of rotation. Now we can take this right back off and check our clearance. The BMW spec on a rod bearing clearance is anywhere between 0.025 millimeters and 0.071 millimeters. So if we take this, the way the plastic gauge works is you want to line it up with the size of the plastic. So we can see here the first mark is 0.025, and that mark is bigger than the plastic gauge. So that means the clearance is greater than that. If we go up 0.038, we see that it's basically perfectly in line with that. And if we go higher, 0.51, the mark on the crank is definitely bigger than that. So I'd say our clearance is basically right on at 0.038, which is perfect. We're right in the middle of the spec. So now we'll clean this off, put some assembly lube, and get it all back together. Get a brake clean. Don't be shy with the assembly lube. And this is just going to give us a little bit more protection on the first start. Same thing on the upper. Get the rod cap back on. This time new bolts. And then lastly, I just marked the 2 bolts with a marker to be sure I know that they're torqued. Now with all the rod bearings done, we can put the windage tray / pickup tube back in, but first I'm going to come in here and just wipe down all these surfaces. Now I mentioned this before, but like I said, always replace the O-ring on the pickup tube. Put this down, slowly push this in. And now we can replace all 9 of these E10 screws that hold the windage tray in. Don't forget, these are torque to yield, so they all need to be replaced as well. And there's no torque sequence on this, so I'm just going to work from the middle out. I really hate when bolts are torqued so low, especially a bolt like this. I mean, an E10 is not that small, and it's only 4 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. I mean, I have to put such little resistance on that ratchet. I feel like I could still probably undo these with my fingers. Obviously not, but my point is, don't try and torque it more just because it doesn't feel right. Always go with whatever the spec says. So now one last check in here before we put the oil pan back on. We've got all the rod bearings in, new bolts, everything torqued down. The oil pump is torqued. The sprocket is torqued. There's a new gasket on the pickup tube, new bolts on the windage tray. So all that's left to do is just put the oil pan back on. Brand new gasket. And now we can put this back in place. And like pretty much everything on this car, these bolts are torque to yield, and they also come with some new thread sealant on here, so these need to be replaced. This engine uses 3 different size bolts, so there's 7 of the longest ones that go here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Then there's 3 of the medium lengths, which go 1, 2, and 3, and then 18 of the smallest ones that go around the perimeter. Just pay attention because the kit of bolts that you receive is good for multiple engines from N52s, N54s, N55s, manual, automatic transmission, and some of them have different bolt patterns, so it's normal that you might have a couple left over in your kit. The longest and medium length bolts are torqued to 8 Newton meters plus 180 degrees, and the smaller ones are 8 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. We'll get a new gasket on the oil level sensor while we're here. Nice, good as new. Now we're going to take a look at the turbo. So this stock turbo with low mileage would definitely be fine to reuse. The turbine has no play, spins smoothly. Wastegate doesn't have any excessive play either, but when you tune these, they kind of run out of power because they're just not very big. They make peak torque very quickly, as of about 2500 RPM, but in the higher RPMs, there's a significant drop off because it just can't keep up, which is why we'll be installing this pure 500 replacement turbo. You can think of this as kind of a stage 1 turbo upgrade. It retails for just over $1,000 US with no cores, so it's a really good value for what you get. It's the same size as stock, but with a better and larger compressor wheel, and with the right tuning and fueling upgrades, these can make close to 500 wheel horsepower. But that's not what we're going to be aiming for in this build. As you guys know, I'm more of an OEM or OEM plus kind of guy, and I want this to be a fun, reliable daily driver kind of car. And obviously I say reliable relatively speaking because we're still talking about a BMW here, but even tuned for pump gas, this is a better turbo than stock, so we'll have more area under the torque curve and it'll pull harder to redline. Now the big question, how much power is it actually going to make? Well, I don't really know. But first, we're going to focus on getting everything installed and trying to get this swap to actually work. Then eventually later in the series, we'll get it tuned, dynoed, and find out exactly how much power we're putting down. The install is pretty easy. We just got to swap over the wastegate actuator and a diverter valve, but I just bought a new one instead. They also have upgrades for these to give you more of that blow-off valve style of noise. But again, not my style, and these stock ones hold up just fine because they use the exact same part in the N63s as well. Luckily, these are not torqued very much. Okay, now I'm just going to take off this retaining clip to separate the two pieces. Well, try to at least. As you can hear, almost no play in this wastegate. I mean, it's basically like new. There we go. Now I'm going to undo the V-band holding both sides together. Just pop this up. And now this is more than likely seized together. So a couple love taps here, but we'll probably have to get out the torch and heat this up to separate these. Oh, wow. I guess that's the difference when you're working on a car that comes from Texas instead of Quebec, that this is actually something that's possible to do. Okay, so like I said, this turbo's in great shape. It's got no play in it, spins super smoothly, so there's nothing wrong with it, but we're just gonna do the upgrade. So we can get rid of everything here. I'm replacing all these lines, obviously, and we've got a new diverter valve. And just comparing the two side by side from this angle, you can really see how much bigger the new wheel is versus the old one. And then on the replacement turbo, whether it's an upgraded one or an original one, there's always gonna be this little pin here. That way you can line up the two halves perfectly. Now we can get these back together, line up the alignment pin, and it clicks right into place. Get this V-band back on. Now there's no torque spec on this V-band because BMW actually never separates any turbos. Obviously they just replace the entire unit. So I'm just gonna wrench it down with a little 1/4-inch tool and that'll be good. Now we can put the actuator back in. And then the torque spec on these tiny screws, believe it or not, is actually 2 Newton meters plus or minus 0.3 Newton meters. Now listen, generally I am pretty anal about these things. Make sure to do it properly, but I mean, that is ridiculous. So these are going in with my screwdriver, and however tight they go, that's how they're gonna stay. I'll get the circlip back on. Perfect. Lastly, we can do the diverter valve. There's an alignment pin on here. Get that lined up. New screws. I bought new ones, but I'm pretty sure you could just replace the Loctite and you'd be just fine. Brand new oil and coolant lines. This oil feed line is a little bit tricky. There's not a lot of room, so you kind of tuck it in behind like this and then line it up. And lastly, some brand new graphite gaskets. Oh mon Dieu, look at this thing. Oh, I'm so happy. I can't wait to get this thing running. If you take a close look, you can see that on the wastegate arm and on the outlet of the turbo, there are these two nicks. And I think what happened was when they were disassembling the car, they either couldn't or didn't want to take the V-band off and they just cut it with a grinder. So the one on the wastegate arm really isn't deep. It's more of a visual thing. So I'm not too concerned about that. The one on the outlet isn't really deep either. It does cut a little bit more. So I'm just going to touch this up with a welder. Again, I don't really think it's necessary, but I'm going to do it while I'm here. There you go, quick 5-minute fix, good as new. Now we can reinstall the turbo, and I have all new hardware. Now we can get this back on. While it's going in, obviously just make sure that all the lines are lined up. New copper nuts. And now to torque these down, there's a specific torque sequence that you have to follow. I'll put that up on screen right now, but basically you start from inside and work your way out. First you do 8 Newton meters and then you repeat everything at 13 Newton meters. Now we can get the T45s that support the turbo on the bottom. Now I'm going to torque down the oil and coolant lines. Engine support arm. Now we can get this coolant pipe back on. I also put a new O-ring on here, of course. Now, I might not mention this on every single part, but basically anything I'm putting back in a car is either going to be new or have a new gasket on it. New water pump. I'm not sure how well you guys can see this on camera, but on the other side of the hose here, there's this white mark, which is where you need to line up the screw for the hose clamp. Now we're going to tackle the front of the engine. So first we're going to do these Vano solenoids. Now we'll do the entire accessory belt system. So we'll start by taking this tensioner off. It's looking pretty nasty in here. Brand new tensioner. Brand new alternator. And only start the first two, because first we have to hook up this AC compressor bracket, which will then go like this, and then you can slide the bolt through to sandwich it together. Like we saw before, mine was damaged, so I just got this used replacement. And it's just important to make sure that you have dowels in both of these holes when you're installing it. And then the idea here is before this thing is actually tight, you get these two screws, put them through, and now you can torque these down. I'm going to put the AC compressor on, and just like the bracket, make sure that there's also the two dowels in these two holes here. And the AC compressor is also torqued to 19 Newton meters. We'll get a new idler pulley on. Can't forget the cap. And lastly, our brand new belt. Goes around the crank, goes around the AC compressor, up and around the idler, and right over the alternator. Now we can remove the safety pin. And now we have a brand new OE belt drive system. So the tensioner and idler are from INA, and the alternator and AC compressor are from Denso. We'll crank this over now just for fun. Absolutely perfect. And now I'm sure you guys can tell, but I'm not really working in any particular order here. Basically, whatever parts come in the mail, I'm putting on the car. Now it's time for my favorite part of any job, which, as usual, is replacing the wiring harness. I mean, I already don't like doing this on a good day, and in this case, there's two things working against us that are going to make it even a little bit more difficult. The first thing is that, like you saw at the start of the video, there was a bunch of this stuff that was already unhooked or unclipped, so I don't actually know where all of this went before. And then the second thing is that normally the number one tip I give people is to kind of pay attention to the plastic memory in the wiring, so you can see it bends one way or another, and after so many heat cycles, the wire kind of wants to stay that way. But again, like you guys saw, one of the wiring harnesses was damaged. So I have this new wiring harness, and these cables are straight as a board. So I'm not really sure how this is gonna work, but let's see how it goes. First, I'm gonna reinstall the engine support arm. Okay, and now I'm going to start by hooking up our new wiring harness to these two bolts. Now, before I get too far here, I know that I need to run the main power line from the other side to the starter, up along here, and then into the alternator, so we'll do that right now. While I still have easy access, I'll plug in the fuel supply. Now we'll get our brand new Denso starter in here. Obviously not bolting it down yet because that goes through the transmission bell housing. But now we can run this wire through, and this actually doesn't go into this holder. That's for an evap line or something. Then we go underneath the high pressure fuel pump supply and onto the alternator. On the alternator side, this is supposed to be torqued to 19 Newton meters, but with the AC bracket here, I can't get a torque wrench in, so it's gonna go hand tight. Clip this here. Now we'll continue with the connections. See, look at this. This is a perfect example of what I was talking about with the plastic memory. So this cable is completely straight. I'm trying to figure out where this thing goes. Obviously not to the AC compressor, obviously not to the alternator. I look back at my footage and it turns out that it loops like this and plugs into the starter. So we ran into a little problem here. As you can see, this connector is not the same for the high pressure fuel pump. And that's because this is an updated harness, which is supposed to be used with the updated fuel pump. Now, I'm not going to be upgrading the fuel pump for no reason because there's no difference between this one and the newer style that has a revised connector. If there was an improved flow or anything like that, I'd consider upgrading. But since it's the same part, now I'm just going to splice the harness with the old connector. Pull this out a bit. Man, nothing pains me more than having to cut into this brand new $500 harness, but here it goes. All right, well, I mean, that looks not bad, not great though. I'm still gonna wrap it in a little bit of electrical tape, and then that's also why I made the splice a little bit lower down. That way it's hiding in the sheathing anyway, so it's gonna be pretty well protected. Okay, and now it is a little bit too big for this piece of wiring loom, but unfortunately there's nothing I can really do about that. Like I said, between the waterproof splice, the tape, and this, it's gonna be fine. Now we'll get the brake booster line back in. Grab this. Now we're gonna keep going with the intake manifold. So as you can see, I've already replaced all 6 intake runner gaskets. I've replaced the gasket for the DME, and I also replaced the gasket in the throttle body. Now to get the DME back on, you just line up the pattern with the intake manifold. And then there's 4 E8 screws that go on this side. And then two 8mm bolts on this side. All right, so it looks like everything is all set. So I'm gonna start by getting the intake manifold lined up here. We'll keep going with the harness that goes to the back of the car with the transmission. Got a main power hookup down here. And this plugs into the DME here, I guess. And then this surely clips like this. That looks about right. And then all these connectors on the other side go to the junction box on the car. Oh boy, isn't this fun. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So I think that now we could probably bolt the intake manifold back on. There are 5 nuts and then 2 bolts on this side. Get the ignition coil harness in here. Now we'll just finish up the wiring harness on the front of the engine here. So I'm going to replace the stock aluminum bolts with these steel bolts. I don't know why they used aluminum bolts. I understand in some cases, for example, on the N52 with a magnesium block, you need to have the aluminum fasteners or you get galvanic corrosion. But the N55 is an aluminum block, and for example, the alternator, the AC compressor, all those bolts are steel anyway. So are these two for the flange of the coolant hose. So it's not a problem to use them. I don't know why they used aluminum to begin with, but I'm going to replace them with these. This last connector here goes onto the PCV heater on the turbo inlet hose. And then the last thing, we have our water pump. Just going to feed that through, clips in right here. And then I'm also going to be replacing the ground for the water pump. So again, the stock bolt is an aluminum bolt. And I've never seen this happen, but apparently what can happen over time is the vibration causes the bolt to break. And then the water pump isn't working because it's not grounded. So I'm going to replace this with a steel screw here. And then the replacement steel screw is torqued to 19 Newton meters. But if you're using the aluminum screw, it needs to be replaced. And the torque spec is 8 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. Now we can do the fuel rail. Now I'll torque down the main feed line and the injectors. Now I'll do these grounds. Now the only thing that's left is just to plug in all the connectors. Holder for the O2 sensors. Okay, well, that's it for today, guys. I'm exhausted right now. It's like 2 o'clock in the morning, but I really wanted to get this done so I could get a video out, but also just because I want to get this project going. Now, what we did today was the easy part, because all we're doing is following the instructions in a service manual for a 335, look up the repair, do what it says, and that's it. In the next episode, part 2, that's where things are going to get a little bit more interesting, because there's no instructions on how I'm going to get this engine into that car. The only thing I know for sure is that the engine does fit inside the car. The transmission bolts up, the motor mounts, the subframe, all that's good. So physically we'll get the engine in the car, but everything else, we're kind of going to figure that out as we go, because I know the cooling system's different. Most importantly, I have no idea how we're going to get this DME with a mismatched VIN to communicate with all the other modules in the car. But like I said, that'll be for part 2. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one. Thanks, guys.